This overview for the readings for CEP917 for the week of October 2nd covers the authors Donald Schoen and Nigel Cross, and this is just meant to give you a little bit of background on the authors and an overview for the readings. So there's a lot to digest in these chapters, and there's much more detail than we could cover in a brief presentation, but hopefully this will just give you a little bit of context for the next week. So our first author, Donald Schoen, was a visiting professor at MIT for many years. He's a major name in design studies, and having first read Herbert Simon in this class and now Schoen, you will have covered two of the most foundational authors on design studies. So he worked across many fields, always tied to the practical disciplines: architecture, design, education, computer sciences, and many others. He was trained as a philosopher, but it was his concern with the development of reflective practice in design and in learning systems that he's most known for. So reflective practice is concerned with how people develop mastery and how they get better at something through reflection on their work and through reflection in action. And Schoen was hugely influential in teacher education. So if you're familiar with some of the reflective practice work in the TE department here at MSU, then you're familiar with some of his work. So reflective practice has its major theoretical roots in education through the work of John Dewey. And John Dewey was a major proponent of reflection and action. It's not actually that new of an idea. It comes from Plato's original principle of know thyself, or the idea that when you begin to work and think reflectively and reflexively, you can begin to develop mastery in an issue or subject matter. And reflection occurs in a looping manner. So at each stage, you stop to reflect before considering how to proceed, and that drives the whole process going forward. So this particular chapter from Schoen's book, Design as Reflective Conversation, suggests that in the work of design, we make something tactile and we give it shape by writing it down in plans, ideas, sketches, other things that are more concrete like that, or by building a prototype. So when we do this, or give something a concrete nature, we actually create situations that then talk back to us. And this back talk, and our listening to it and engaging in a dialogue with it, is an essential part of the creative or design process. So by giving the design itself some kind of a shape, whether that's through sketches or writing it down in the form of ideas, making it something that has form, we allow the process of design to take shape through this reflection. And Schoen uses the example of a reflective dialogue through this architecture example. And in that example that you'll read in this chapter, the master imposes a kind of discipline and order upon a situation before he actually starts to consider the possibilities and work with the situation in practice. It's almost like you need to give it a framework for the problem in order to work with it and to consider the possibilities. So in this particular example, the architecture student is having a hard time conforming her design to the strange features of a terrain or a landscape. And he suggests, no, don't try to fit it to the landscape. First start by imposing an order on the situation, and later you can break it open and make changes or do away with it even. But you need to start with something in order to consider a scenario and then reflect and consider the implications or the design paths or decision paths in practice. So the idea of this being kind of treated as a global experiment where the results aren't apparent from the get-go, but we engage in a reflective conversation to discover them, just basically means that you don't always know where the design process is going until you try out possibilities and then you engage in a reflective conversation. And our second author, from which we have 3 chapters this week, is Nigel Cross. He's a professor of design studies at Open University. Just a few topics of interest, or of his research interest and writing interest, are computer-aided design, design methodology and practices, design research, epistemology, and cognition. And this particular book that we're reading some chapters from, Design Early Ways of Knowing, is very significant in the field of design because Cross was one of the first people, when he wrote this book some 30-odd years ago, who was the first person to really articulate or start to describe this idea of design early ways of knowing, or ways of thinking about things or dealing with problems that are very specific to how designers operate. In the first chapter, The Creative Leap, Cross suggests that there's this idea in design culture and popular culture of a creative leap, or of a sudden illuminating flash or an insight that just seems to come out of nowhere. But he suggested it's really more of a bridge than a leap, because these ideas are built into the design process, or ideas are built up during the design process, I should say. They aren't necessarily just wild flashes that occur in a vacuum. They often occur in earlier or similar ideas that happen during brainstorming sessions. So it's not really about making sudden, out-of-left-field proposals, but exploring and trying to seek out the best suited solution to a situation. So that's why he says that creative design is about exploration and not search. He also mentions the fact that a lot of times creative ideas or these creative leaps are actually identified during the review process, where designers or design teams go back after a brainstorm session or after they've generated ideas and consider what worked or what didn't work, or where some possibilities lie that they can work from. In the next chapter from Cross on creative strategies, he goes through 3 case studies of expert designers and takes away some themes that seem to be common to all of them and that tell us something about the design process at the expert level. So one of them is the idea of taking a broad systems approach to the problem, where it just basically means that you're not accepting narrow problem criteria, so that you're not so confined early on that you limit the process. The next one is framing the problem in a distinctive and sometimes personal way, so that expert designers often draw upon personal knowledge or experiences of a situation, or of using a device or an artifact themselves, and use that personal knowledge to help influence their design process and their problem solutions. The last one that he mentions is designing from first principles. So first principles are essentially basic foundational and guiding laws of a domain, where in design work these can be domain specific based on disciplinary knowledge for a project. Like in physics or engineering, there's basic foundational properties of physics or of structures that have to be worked with, or they can be more domain general. So he uses the example of in modernist design, where form follows function as a sort of design rule or foundational principle. And in the final chapter from Cross, Understanding Design Cognition, he's basically dealing with themes of how designers formulate problems, generate solutions, and process strategies. And this chapter is really almost sort of a lit review / design research, where he goes through a lot of existing empirical design work and pulls out important themes that seem to occur. And within each of these categories of formulating, generating, processing, Cross describes a lot of different themes that are important to how designers think. Things like in formulating problems, design often involves finding appropriate problems as well as solving them. So there's a lot of work that goes into structuring problems and formulating them rather than just accepting the problem as a given. So it's important not to define things too tightly or narrowly early on. At a solution generation stage, that may include thinking about not getting too attached to existing concepts. He mentions this idea of fixation, or not getting fixated on things. Generation of alternatives is discussed, so he cautions actually against excessive expansion of ideas. He mentions that you don't want to be too rigid or too finite in your alternatives or solutions or possibility set, but you also don't want to be so broad and expansive that there's more than you can deal with. Another important thing that he mentions is the idea of sketching, and it seems that across the board, sketching remains the designer's best asset in the process, in that he discusses the fact that all studies of design cognition have basically emphasized the power of the traditional sketch. So this ability to sort of make something concrete and work with that. Basically in process strategies, he discusses the fact that following a reasonably structured but not too rigid process seems to be helpful, and he notes some other important themes there too. So basically what we'd like you to take away from all of this in relation to your next project, which is the radio story project that we'll be introducing and you'll already heard a little bit about, is the idea of a form of design research and looking at design cognition. So when you're doing these radio story projects, you'll basically be looking at doing interviews and conducting a little bit of design research on your own, and also emphasizing the process of design and the design cognition that expert design or designers in practice deal with. And design cognition, since that's what you're getting at, that's paramount to the work of Schoen and Cross. They look at themes and how designers work and how they think, and that's what you'll be looking at in your interviewee or your design practitioner's process as well. So with that, that's all for this week's overview, and in these readings there's a lot more specific details and more themes of design cognition. There's a lot more than we could note here in this presentation, but this should give you a little bit of context for the ideas that these authors are working with, and also be something to consider as you go forward and do some design research and work yourself. So have a great week. We hope you're all doing well, and thanks for watching.